Imagine waking up on your 32nd birthday knowing that today is the last day of your career. Not because you made a mistake. Not because you failed an evaluation. Not because the airline was cutting staff. But simply because the calendar flipped to a number they had decided was too old. This was the reality for thousands of American flight attendants in the 1960s. The moment you turned 32, you were out. No appeal. No exception. No second chance. But the age rule wasn't even the most shocking part. But the fear didn't begin at 32. It began the day they were hired. Because every woman in that uniform knew she was working toward an expiration date. Before they fired you for being too old, they weighed you before every single flight. They checked your girdle. They measured your hips. And if you had gotten married, you were already gone. Today we are going inside the most controlled profession in American history. And what these women were actually forced to endure every single day just to keep their jobs. It's April of 1963. Chicago O'Hare Airport, 6:45 in the morning. Margaret is 27 years old. She has been a Pan Am flight attendant for 3 years and she is considered one of the best on her route. Passengers request her by name. Her supervisors praise her efficiency. She has never once received a negative evaluation. But this morning, before she steps onto a single aircraft, Margaret must pass an inspection that has nothing to do with her ability to save your life in an emergency. She steps onto a scale. The number is recorded in a logbook by a male supervisor. Then he checks her uniform, her makeup, her hair. And yes, he physically confirms she is wearing the correct undergarments. Only after passing this inspection is Margaret allowed to board the plane she is about to work on. And she has exactly 5 years left before they force her out forever. The weight requirements in 1960s American aviation were not a suggestion. They were a termination clause written directly into every flight attendant's contract. Pan Am, American Airlines, TWA, every major carrier maintained strict height and weight charts. If you were 5'4", you could not exceed 130 pounds. Not 131. Not 132. 1 pound over, and you were grounded until you lost it. But it went further than the numbers. Before international flights, attendants were physically inspected for visible weight gain, supervisors were trained to look for changes in the face, the arms, the waistline. If something looked different, you were pulled off the flight and sent to be weighed again. Former Pan Am attendant Dorothy Davies described the experience decades later. She said the inspections made you feel less like a professional and more like livestock being evaluated before auction. And the cruelest part? These women were also required to serve full meals, pour drinks, and smile through 7-hour transatlantic flights, all while maintaining a weight their bodies were not designed to hold. One former attendant recalled surviving on black coffee and cigarettes for days before her weigh-in. Not because she wanted to. Because her rent depended on it. If the weight rules sound extreme, the marriage policy was something else entirely. In the early 1960s, most American airlines had a simple rule. Get married, lose your job. Immediately. No transition period. No farewell flight. Hand in your wings and go home. The reasoning airlines gave publicly was that marriage would distract attendants from their professional duties. But the real reason was far more calculated. A married woman might get pregnant. A pregnant woman required leave. Leave costs money. And a fresh 21-year-old graduate with no seniority, no benefits, and no negotiating power cost almost nothing. The system was designed to cycle women out at the peak of their usefulness and replace them with cheaper, newer versions of themselves. Margaret knew this. Every woman in her uniform knew this. So they hid their relationships. They removed their rings before inspections. They whispered about engagements in break rooms and said nothing to supervisors. They lived double lives, professionally pristine on the outside, quietly terrified on the inside. And then there was the rule that haunted every single one of them from the day they were hired. The age cutoff. At most major American airlines in the 1960s, 32 was the hard stop. Some carriers set it at 35. American Airlines briefly enforced it at 30. But the message was always the same: youth was the product, and once it expired, so did your career. Margaret calculated it in her head regularly. She had joined at 24. The cutoff was 32. That gave her 8 years. 8 years to build a career, earn seniority, and then nothing. What made this rule particularly brutal was what it ignored completely. By the time a flight attendant reached 32, she was not less qualified. She was more qualified. She had managed medical emergencies at 35,000 feet. She had calmed panicked passengers during mechanical failures. She had memorized evacuation procedures for multiple aircraft types. But none of that mattered. Because the airlines were not selling safety. They were selling the image of youth. And when your image had an expiration date, so did your career. Former TWA attendant Sandra Reeves later told investigators that she spent her 31st birthday crying in a hotel room in London. Not because she was unhappy, but because she could feel the clock running out on the only professional life she had ever known. But here is what the airlines did not predict. These women fought back. In 1965, Dusty Rhodes, a United Airlines flight attendant, became one of the first to formally challenge the age and marriage restrictions through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She argued that no equivalent rules existed for male pilots. That a man could fly until he retired, but a woman was discarded at 32. She was right. And she was not alone. By the late 1960s, flight attendants across the country began filing complaints, organizing collectively, and refusing to quietly disappear when their contract said they should. In 1968, the EEOC ruled that age and marriage restrictions for flight attendants were a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Airlines fought the ruling for years. But one by one, the policies collapsed. Margaret, in our story, was one of the fortunate ones. She stayed. She flew into her 40s. She eventually became a trainer for new hires. But she never forgot what it felt like to count down the years on a calendar that someone else controlled. When we look back at these rules today, it is easy to call them relics of a less enlightened time and move on. But before we do that, consider this. The logic behind these rules. That your value has an expiration date, that your personal life is your employer's business, that your body is part of your professional presentation, that logic did not disappear in 1968. It simply became quieter. Today no airline will weigh you before a flight. No contract will say you must be unmarried. No supervisor will check your undergarments. But in offices, boardrooms, and hiring decisions across the country, the idea that a woman's worth has a shelf life remains very much alive. Just dressed in different language. Margaret's story is not just history. It is a mirror. And the question worth asking is, what unspoken rules are we still following today, without even realizing it?